So the starting point for me is to look at how Canada has changed and continues to change and will continue to change going into the 21st century. If you went back 40 years ago, the racialized population in Canada represented about 4% of the population. There had been a level of stability to the proportion of the population that was racialized for many years. And part of what explains that is that we, as a Canadian society, very early on, made a determination that we wanted a country that had a particular ethnic characteristic. We wanted Canada to be white. And so a range of efforts, both federal and provincial, as well as from community organizations, were undertaken to ensure that Canada remained a white society. A whole set of exclusions relating to immigration were undertaken legislatively and administratively to ensure that Canada remained as white as possible. And that was the case for most of Canada. When you hear about the head tax, the Chinese head tax, when you hear about Chinese exclusions, and when you hear about people coming from South Asia being stopped at the borders of Canada in the late 1800s and the early 1900s and being sent back because they were not part of a quote-unquote continuous passage from that part of the British Empire to this part of the British Empire. We were part of one dominion at the time, and so people could legally travel from one part of that dominion to the other part of the dominion, except for the Canadian government's administrative imposition of a requirement that people had to travel continuously if they were going to be allowed into Canada. They did not travel continuously, which even today is a challenge where people fly. It's a challenge for the aircraft to come from Mumbai directly to Canada, never mind ships that used to sail in those periods. If all of that had not been in place, if all those exclusions had not been in place, imagine 100 years of migration from South Asia and East Asia. What would Canada look like? It would look completely different. What we're doing now is actually catching up to what essentially would have been a natural process of people migrating to areas where there is opportunity or where there's protection, right? And so in the 1960s, we changed our minds about who we would allow into the country. And we decided that we would be a lot more objective about who would allow into the country. We would ensure that those who had a certain set of skills, who had the qualifications that we enumerated, would be allowed into the country regardless of whether they came from the Middle East or Asia or Africa or the Caribbean or Latin America or Northern Europe or Eastern Europe. And that is really what it should have been like all along, but it wasn't. So when we come into this conversation, with that baggage. What that history did also was to establish hierarchies that determined how people were incorporated into Canadian life, and particularly into the labor market. So that is all the baggage that we come into this conversation with. And I'm suggesting today that now we have a much more natural process of immigration going on, and so part of that is what explains the fact that by 2031, 1 in every 3 Canadian will be a racialized person, and 1 in every 2 in the Greater Toronto area will be a racialized person. So it matters what opportunities people from racialized communities have in terms of being fully integrated into the labor market and being fully integrated into Canadian society and being fully integrated into our neighborhoods. and being full participating members of our neighborhood. Pure region happens to be one of the regions that has some of the highest levels of immigration. Right? Between 2001 and 2006, it had an immigration rate of about 32%, one of the highest in the country. And that is already showing in terms of the population profile, 50%, 49.8% of the population is racialized, about 48% immigrants. So I want to suggest that that does mean something to how we do our business as people who work with various communities that are disadvantaged in various ways. It does make a difference in terms of how the United Way does its work, in terms of how the United Way agencies do their work, in terms of how the regional field government and bureaucracy do their work, and in terms of how we conceive of ourselves as neighborhoods, as communities. I think that's an important point to be made. So the demographic changes essentially are redefining our communities. But they're redefining our communities both in important and positive ways, but also in ways that may not necessarily be important. There's the potential for our communities to become stronger, to build on the strength that they have, but there's also the potential for our communities to be undermined, to become weaker, if we don't address some of the issues that arise from this tremendous change that is going on in our communities and in our society. Part of how this shows up, of course, is that we have racialized populations that are both significant proportions of our communities, but also congregating in particular neighborhoods. And that's an important observation. Part of it is showing up in our schools. We have a lot of learners who have English as a second language. Many of them are immigrants, some of them are not immigrants, but in their homes, they're speaking a whole range of languages. So Brampton, when I first came to Brampton in the early 80s, Brampton felt very British. Who was here? Brampton felt very, very British. I didn't do Mississauga a lot, and I used to go to school in Winnipeg, and I'd come back for the summers. But I didn't do Mississauga a lot, so I can speak more to Brampton. But Brampton felt very, very English, very, very British. Well, today Brampton feels kind of different than it did in the early 80s. That is just a manifestation of perhaps more important trends that are taking place in Peel region, right? Punjabi, Chinese, Urdu, Spanish, Polish, those are languages that are spoken a lot more widely than they were back then. We have kids coming into the schools that speak these languages as their first languages. Right? We have some challenges with regards to the experience of socio-economic success amongst many of these populations. That speaks to how well we're doing with regard to integrating people into our communities and into our neighborhoods. And to some extent, that's something that I want to spend a bit of time on.